Hi, and welcome to another newspaper article, Lucky Dip, with myself, Elfie Boy, and my most beautiful of co-hosts, Yvette, from whom we shall steal a hat. Now, trigger warnings, as always, there's likely to be some. I don't know what they're going to be until they're out the hat, so look in the description below, make sure that there's not going to be any articles read out that affect you personally. We'll get into it, shall we? Let's get going. Now, Elfie boy. Good John. You're already shattered, pal. What have we got first? We have the Ross-shire Journal for Friday the 15th of December 1882. We'll see what the Ross-shire Journal has for us. Okay, our first article is entitled The Procession of Death in Silesia. That doesn't sound like the most positive article to start on, but here we are. So it reads, amongst the inhabitants of Silesia, now a province of Russia, consisting of a mixture of German and Slavonian races, there has existed from the most remote times a very strange custom, the procession of death, which takes place early in the spring, before Easter. With the Germans, death is represented by a puppet dressed in man's clothing. The procession is only composed of men, the fair sex contenting themselves with looking at the show. Amongst the Slavonians, on the contrary, death is a puppet dressed in female garb, which is carried by young girls. This difference arises from the fact that the word death, Fod, is masculine in German and smert, feminine in Slavonic. As soon as winter is over, which is the image of death, the inhabitants of the different villages and boroughs of Silesia think it their duty to drive death away from their places of abode and throw it into the river, a rivulet or an ell. They throw it into the water especially, because water was the element that kept death a prisoner throughout the winter. A lake would not be suitable, but a river, becoming free and increased by the thawing of the snow, is the right element in which it is necessary to drown that terrible divinity. The young ladies put on for the occasion their most beautiful attire, and merrily go to the river, carrying the puppet on their shoulders. The young men follow, throwing their hats in the air, shouting merrily. One of the young ladies carries behind the procession a small fir with wreaths on. It is the emblem of life, the strength of nature opposed to death. When the procession arrives on the banks of the river, the young girls throw the puppet into the water. Loud cries of joy resound, and the whole day is then given up to pleasure, singing and dances. The songs sung on the occasion present a medley of Christian and heathen ideas, but they praise charity, which is really largely practiced on that day. In the village inns, a splendid dinner is prepared at the expense of the community, and all, rich and poor, are invited to take part in it. The poor, besides, receive a distribution of cast-off dresses. So that just shows you can't really tell what an article is going to give you until you get into it. The title didn't suggest that that was going to be as light-hearted an article as I was expecting, so that's pretty good. I'm not sure. When it comes to death, customs and rituals, I think Mexico and down into Southern America, you get that fairly frequently. Maybe in some Asian places where there are cultures who will open up the graves, like in the Day of the Dead in Mexico. They'll open the graves of deceased ancestors and they'll take care of the corpses, and some of them will be part of parades, and folk are invited to give gifts and offerings, usually of food, to the dead. And why not? I mean, death is very much a part of life, but we're quite removed from it in our society these days, where your loved one passes and they're immediately weeked off to the funeral directors, are suddenly in some corporation or some business's hands, to be prepared for the send off, the funeral, and you don't see any of the preparation. You don't tend to be part of any of the preparation for death. Whereas prior to funeral businesses becoming prevalent in the 19th century, it would be the women of the family that would prepare the body of the dead relative and would look after them. There would be wakes, which now it's something that happens after a funeral. It's when you have the party after the funeral, the time to let go of the stress and come to terms with the grief and talk about all your memories of the person you've lost and keep them alive that way. But wakes back in the day would be prior to the funeral, where you would sit up all night with the body. We've done a death customs in Scottish history video. It was a two-parter that ended with an exhibition of some mourning jewellery that I've acquired over the years. But people should know that they don't have to be so removed from death. There are options. If you want to prepare the body of a lost loved one, there's no one that can tell you you're unable to do that. You can do that for yourself. You don't have to give your partner or lost relative to some stranger to do it for you. You can prepare your loved one if you want. Also, embalming is not a necessary step, and in fact can cause more harm than good when it comes to the body decomposing in the ground. All of those chemicals also seep into the ground and the earth, and they're not beneficial. Those are toxic chemicals. So you have the option to say no to being embalmed. It's not a requirement, and I'm not sure that everyone's fully aware of that. And it is a substantial extra cost when it comes to funerals. It's one you don't have to be paying. The Lynn Crematorium in Glasgow, as far as I could see, they seem to be the only burial place that had a section set aside for natural burials, or I think they termed them woodland burials. And to be able to fit the bill to be buried there, you're not allowed to be embalmed. You're to be as natural as possible. And I'm into it. That's where I've decided I'm going. Also, what people find to be beneficial and give them peace of mind is creating, it's more than a will, it's an advanced directive. So I have one on the family computer, and it's entitled Jen's Dead, and I'm not sure that Alex is super stoked with that. But what it is directions on what I want done with my corpse when it is available to be buried and prepared, etc. It also outlines what I would want for my funeral, music choices, etc. And it also includes what I want done with random Scottish history once I'm past. There's a final goodbye message for the website, and I have created a video that is ready to go for when that day comes. And the idea of an advance directive is so that your relatives aren't going into the funeral directors and getting taken in to a certain extent by those businesses. The funeral director's job is to sell coffins, and the most expensive ones are the ones they're going to want to try and sell you on. They're hermetically sealed, and the embalming that's unnecessary. You're not. No one expects to be dug up after they're buried. So why would people be paying through the nose to preserve the body as long as possible? We don't need hermetically sealed coffins. We don't need embalming. We don't need any of the gaudy extras that they try to sell you on. And an advance directive means that you can go to these places in full knowledge of what your loved one wanted and expected from their funeral, so that you're not paying over the odds for unnecessary extras. And it gives them peace of mind. They're not left wondering, oh, I don't know if I did that right. I don't know if that's what they would have wanted. I don't know, because you're lost in grief at the point of death of a loved one. You're floundering to a certain extent, and when you're in that emotional state, you're particularly susceptible to being taken advantage of. So I would encourage people to write their own advance directives. If nothing else, it's an interesting process to go through. There's a lot to think about, and it does take some weight off the shoulders, just knowing that things are likely to go how you'd like after you're no longer here. So it's not as morbid a discussion as people seem to take it. Death is a very interesting subject. But again, I have a 2-part video that goes into quite a lot of detail on these things. I'll have another one. Oh, we've picked out 2. What's this one? The Glasgow Saturday Post and Paisley and Renfrewshire Reformer for the 22nd of June 1861. We'll see what this paper has. I'm not sure I've heard of it before. Okay, so this one is going to be from when I did the gender fluidity in Scottish history mini documentary for Independence Live. So we have employment of women. The Birmingham whipmakers are on strike against the initiation of women into the art and mystery of whip making. The female poor are to be pitied, with a lamentable want of remunerative branches of employment, almost all their attempts to better their condition by sharing in the monopoly of the male sex, however suitable the employment, are sure to be met with ungallant resistance. Only let a woman unsex herself by the assumption of male attire, and many good sources of livelihood are open to her without let or hindrance, till found out, and then her occupation is gone, and the resumption of female attire brings with it a great reduction of wages and a restricted sphere of industry. Why should this be so? In the case of whip-making, which would appear to be not unsuitable to women, even though they should succeed in obtaining a share of the work and do it as well, too, as the men, doubtless they will still earn far less wages, unless they disguise themselves in male attire. In every way a very unfair mode of treating poor women, say we. And that's right. the majority of cases of women adopting male attire and living their lives as men, mostly undercover and without being found out, they did very well for themselves, and they were a lot freer than their own sex otherwise are generally. At this time, I mean, women couldn't vote. This is 1861. The reformers were at this point trying to get the franchise given to working men, all working men, like regardless of what property they owned. Um, so we were a long way away from the suffragettes at this point. But there were women did very well for themselves, and I've talked about them before, where they would become captains of army regiments, and they would only be found out on being wounded or becoming pregnant. And it seemed like there was less reason for men to adopt female attire in terms of employment, because they would be restricting themselves. Women were so restricted in what they could and couldn't do, what they had a right to do in law. But a lot of women did just go, you know what, nah, I'm going to do this for myself. I'm going to forego the usual expected path of marriage and children, and I'm going to try and earn myself some decent money, get myself set up, and just do the thing. You had couples that folk would believe were married couples of no particular note, but it would be two women living together, one that would live as a man, to all intents and purposes in public, and it happened a lot. So this article really outlines that they can't understand why are women exempt from certain aspects of the workplace. That's a very progressive article for the time, and there's a lot you can read into it. But I'll have another. Fingers aren't working today. We have the Aberdeen Evening Express for Saturday the 31st of March 1951. So this is fairly contemporary for random Scottish history. We'll see what it has for us. Okay, I don't know what to expect from this one. It will be our last due to the length of it. It's entitled Kennedy's Mad Ride to Aberdeen, or Hijinks on the High Road. See what it has for us. It reads, Aberdeen during the earlier half of last century was notorious for the hijinks and practical jokes in which a convivial section of its eminent citizens delighted to indulge. In his Memoirs of Men and Manners, an Aberdeenshire army officer, Prize Lockhart Gordon, remarked that it is on the high-spirited jokes of sage men, which have a little wickedness mingled with their waggery, that the chief peculiarity of the Aberdonian rests. One butt for the hoaxes of a coterie of literary and legal men was, strange as it may seem, Aberdeen's annalist, William Kennedy. Some of the historian's acquaintances, who well knew how to take him down a peg, induced Kennedy to join a specially organised party going seafowl shooting at Skaterraw, a little to the south of Aberdeen. Two of the conspirators egged Kennedy on to boast of his skill with the shotgun. Further baiting made him assert that he was no mean horseman either. The reverse was true about his ability as a sportsman or equestrian. Kennedy, however, warily refused to ride to Skaterall. Along with one of the artful jokers, he journeyed in a post-chaise, while another companion kept caracolly beside the carriage on a particularly spirited horse. The trio joined others of the gang at a fish dinner in the village. Care was taken that Kennedy got plenty to drink to put him in proper fettle for the evening's sport. All made their way to a spot accessible only at low water, where it was said a big haul of birds was certain to be had. Fell in showers. Though the historian was so near-sighted that he could barely have seen an elephant at the top of the rock, every time he fired, birds fell in showers around him. For every one the others got, he had at least 50, said Prize Gordon. He was delighted and kept firing away, not perceiving that the point on which he stood was almost covered by the incoming tide. To attract his attention, his associates twice blew a horn and signalled that he should come ashore immediately. Kennedy shouted excitedly for deliverance. He was told to swim back, but frankly admitted that swimming was not one of his accomplishments. A fisherman and his son were in the pay of the conspirators. The boy waded out and relieved Kennedy of his fowling piece. His father took the marooned man on his back, but deliberately stepped into deeper water, into the pot. Yelling that a shark had bitten his leg, the fisherman let Kennedy fall into the pot, completely immersing the terrified gentleman. His rescuer made a pretense of driving away the sea monster, waiting to seize its prey. The first phase of the joke ended when its victim was carried to the inn, trembling with cold and fear. There the landlord gave the show away. He told how, in preparation for Kennedy's visit, 2 men had been employed for a week killing scores of seafowl and carting them to the top of the cliff. As Kennedy stood firing at, but missing, birds fluttering on the cliff's ledges, a man threw down an armful of dead fowl, following every shot. The spoofed sportsman refused to believe this. He was delighted when one of the party produced several newly killed, still warm birds, and declaring that they had been among innumerable other bagged by that adept fowler, Mr. Kennedy. Red flannel. Kennedy clamoured for dry clothing. The landlord greatly regretted that no male attire was available. "We'll soon have your own garments dried," he promised. "Until then, you can wear this to keep out the cold." This consisted of a red flannel petticoat, a long lace-frilled bedgown, and a woolen nightcap. Kennedy had lost his wig and hat when he was deliberately popped into the sea. Necessity compelled the miserable man to don the makeshift garments. Attired in this ludicrous way, he was persuaded to become chairman at a sumptuous supper. The honour restored his bounce. Sundry drams revived him physically. A messenger rushed excitedly into the dining room with a, "For heaven's sake, gentlemen, listen to this." He let it be known that the house next to Kennedy's was burning furiously, that the firefighting gear was out of order, and that Mr. Kennedy's valuable library was in imminent danger. To Aberdeen. Kennedy did not hesitate about going. His books must not burn. "Bring the chaise at once," he ordered, but he was told, "The driver has a wheel detached to repair it. Take a horse and ride hard to Aberdeen." Forgetting his boast about being a skilled rider, he now admitted that he could scarcely sit a horse. But before he knew where he was, the conspirators hoisted him upon what they assured the excited man was a docile, speedy steed. His feet were pushed up to the ankles through the shortened stirrups. His hands, dropping the reins alternately, clutched the horse's mane and groped for a hold on the saddle. A postboy cracked his whip. The horse went racing away. Docile! It was the super-lively mount which had pranced and danced around the chaise on the outward journey. Miraculously, Kennedy managed not to fall off, but the unorthodox angles at which he sat and hung were wonderful to see. People gasped. The tassel of his nightcap kept bobbing this way then that, the glaring petticoat's tails fluttering below the shroud-like bedgown. County people gaped at the fantastic sight, exclaiming, "Guid preserve us, fa's the lunatic, ist man or woman that's gane daft." Soon the remainder of the mounted jokers strung along close behind their victim, hallooing and yelling. In the city streets the cavalcade was received with looks of amazement and peals of laughter. Even in his comical disguise, Kennedy was recognised by many. They too thought he had gone completely mad. At the last app, the horse, being uncontrolled, headed for its stable, saddle-sore. Its saddle-sore rider was helped off, and to the further amusement of the populace, he went running as fast as his female garb would allow to cope with the non-existent fire menace. Realising at last that he had been outrageously made a laughing-stock of twice in one evening, he vowed vengeance on the perpetrators of the elaborately planned and perfectly executed jokes. Some Aberdeen wags, with the assistance of Edinburgh legal men attending a circuit court, played still another prank on the historian. They greased and bristled an old piece of parchment on which were then inscribed meaningless marks made with charcoal. It baffled him. The document was further faked to give it an appearance of great antiquity. The scroll was given to Kennedy, who was told that, as Southern experts had failed to decipher it, he alone could prevent the message on the precious relic being lost to the world. Having spent many hours trying to make sense of the hieroglyphics, Kennedy handed it back, saying that, although its interpretation baffled him, the document was undoubtedly of extreme age and a veritable treasure of its kind. The jokers told him that no one was more worthy to possess it than he. It was therefore his to keep and display to envious fellow antiquarians. Kennedy, overwhelmed with delight, boasted all over the town of this priceless gift. There were miles and miles of smiles before he found how, once again, he had been properly had. That's really mean. That's so mean. And the amount of effort they went to make all of that work. That's so mean. Oh, I'm afraid to say Scots could be fairly evil in their little jokes to be had on their fellow man. There was an April the 1st tradition called running the Gauk, I think. So the Gauk would be basically what would be termed in older days the village idiot. He would be handed a message to deliver to some other person, and the message really only read, send the Gauk onwards, or something to that effect. So the Gauk, the chosen April Fool, would take the message very happily. He's got something to do, he's got purpose. He would go and, likely being unable to read, he wouldn't realise what he was delivering. And the person he would deliver it to would read the note and go, okay, right, I'm going to need you to take this to this person. And he'd go, right, okay. And he'd go off and send it to the next person. And the next person would take it and be, right, yeah, you're going to want to take this over to this person. They could send this fool on runs of miles. They would have them cover some extent of ground on April 1st before someone would finally take pity on them and tell them, listen, do you know what? Well done, job done. You've done exactly what you needed to, and release them from the chain of deliveries that they'd been set on. So that's particularly devastating for the guy, Kennedy, that was taken advantage of in this story. I mean, mainly for the fact that he obviously had an ego that he was prepared to defend at all costs. He was one of those types that would just claim to be great at everything, despite what everyone knew. And he was known, he was already a person of some standing in his community. So everyone would find out about this. Everyone, I mean, how many witnesses were there throughout this story? And he would never have lived that down. And that's a shame for that guy. But if you're going to put yourself on a high pedestal, you've got a long drap down back to the ground, don't you? So I enjoyed that story to end this, and thank you for joining me for it. Elfie has also been very docile and lovely in just being a sleepy boy today, which is nice. And we shall see you for the next one. Take care.